November 10th, 1951, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Three brothers from the Klein family, 8-year-old Kenneth, 6-year-old David, and 4-year-old Danny, leave their residence to go play in nearby Farview Park, but they never return home. When a search effort is launched, the brothers' scents are tracked to the bank of the Mississippi River, and after 2 woolen caps are found on some ice, police conclude that all 3 boys fell into the water and drowned. However, there are a number of suspicious details to make the boys' family suspect they were kidnapped and harmed. But even though the case is reinvestigated decades later, no trace of the Klein brothers is ever found. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be covering a missing children's case in which 3 siblings went missing at the same time, the 1951 disappearance of the Klein brothers. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Thomas Crow, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Thomas. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for 8 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, Thomas's mother, Jennifer Crow, once sent in a request for me to cover the Klein brothers case, so I thought it was about time I did an episode. Nearly 74 years ago, 3 brothers from the same family, 8-year-old Kenneth, 6-year-old David, and 4-year-old Danny, all left their residence in Minneapolis to pay a visit to a nearby park, and while their oldest brother Gordon planned to meet them there, they were nowhere to be found by the time he arrived. After a search effort was launched, a tracking dog supposedly followed the brothers' scent to a spot located on the west bank of the Mississippi River about a mile away. A few days later, a pair of woolen caps which supposedly belonged to the boys were found on some ice about 2 miles down the river, so the Minneapolis Police Department concluded that all 3 brothers likely fell into the river and drowned, and even though they failed to recover their bodies, they decided to close the case. Of course, their family did not buy this theory, and as the years have gone on, their sentiments have been echoed by other investigators who have reviewed this case and believe that the Minneapolis PD reached their decision prematurely. The boys' parents have suspected that someone abducted Kenneth, David, and Danny and intentionally planted the caps at that spot in order to throw off the investigation, and a couple of individuals have popped up on the radar as potential suspects, including a neighbor who happened to pour a new concrete floor in his basement right after the brothers disappeared. We're going to explore a number of different theories on this episode, and 2 of the biggest resources were a book about the case titled The Lost Brothers, A Family's Decades-Long Search, authored by journalist Jack Al-Hai, which would be spun off into a long-form podcast produced by Twin Cities PBS titled Long Lost. In addition, I also want to give a shout out to my friend Heather Groutman, who wrote an extensive article about this case at her website, lostandfoundblogs.com, and also released her own podcast episode about it. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page is over 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of the Klein brothers. Our story begins in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1951, and our victims are a trio of brothers from the Klein family: 8-year-old Kenneth, 6-year-old David, and 4-year-old Danny. The boys' father, Kenneth Klein Sr., was born in the town of Monticello, while their mother, Betty Klein, hailed from the nearby town of Big Lake, and after the couple got married, they relocated to Minneapolis in 1941 and moved into a suburban home on Colfax Avenue in the Hawthorne neighborhood. The Klein's oldest son, Gordon, is 9 years old, and Betty is currently 7 months pregnant with her 5th child. On Sunday, November the 10th, Kenneth Sr. was working his shift as a mechanic at the Northland Milk Company when the boys asked Betty if they could go play in Farview Park, which was located on Lyndale Avenue North, 3.5 blocks away. Since the temperatures were in the 40s that day and there was a cold breeze, Betty was initially reluctant to let them go, but after the boys kept begging her, she finally relented and gave them permission. Since Gordon was in the midst of repairing a broken knife sheath which had been split open, he told his 3 brothers that he wanted to stay home and finish the task, but he would join them later and meet them under a large oak tree in the northwest corner of Farview Park, which was their usual gathering spot. At 1:30 p.m., Kenneth, David, and Danny left their home and walked towards the park, but this would turn out to be the last time they were confirmed to be alive. Gordon eventually headed to the park himself, but when he arrived, there was no sign of his 3 brothers. Gordon returned home and told his mother that he could not find Kenneth, David, or Danny, and a search of the neighborhood also failed to turn up any trace of them. After Betty called her husband at work, Kenneth Sr. was allowed to leave early and perform his own search for the boys, but he was also unsuccessful. At 8:10 p.m., the Kleins finally contacted the Minneapolis Police Department to officially report the boys missing. The police said they would not conduct their own search until the boys had been missing for at least 24 hours, though they said they would have a look around Farview Park and get back to them. Several hours later, at around 3 a.m. on the morning of November the 11th, the police phoned the Klein residence to ask if the boys had returned home, but they had not. By 6:30 p.m. that evening, Kenneth, David, and Danny had still not resurfaced, so detectives finally paid a visit to the Klein residence in order to interview the family and formally launch an investigation, though by this point, the 3 brothers had not been seen for around 29 hours. A door-to-door search was performed in the neighborhood and failed to turn up anything, but sound trucks would be driven through the area broadcasting descriptions of the 3 boys in case anyone had seen them. A massive search effort was performed at Farview Park and the surrounding area, which involved law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and several volunteers, including members of the Boy Scouts of America. A neighborhood resident told police that on the day the Klein brothers went missing, she recalled seeing 3 boys who resembled them sitting on a curb at the corner of 3rd Street and 18th Avenue North, and one of the boys was crying out, quote, "Mommy, Mommy." A tracking dog was brought in to assist with the search, and after it picked up a trace of the boys' scent from underwear in their clothing hamper, the dog wound up following 2 separate trails from this curb. One of them led to the Northside Police Department about 5 miles away, while the second trail came to an end in an uprooted tree located near the west bank of the Mississippi River. This particular spot was near the Lowry Avenue Bridge and about 3 miles from the curb and a mile east from the Klein residence, and children's footprints could also be found near the tree. At the time, the Mississippi River was frozen over with a thin layer of ice, so there was fear that the boys may have fallen into the water. Well, at around 9:30 a.m. on the morning of November the 13th, 3 days after the brothers disappeared, a railroad worker named Helgi Matson spotted 2 plaid woolen caps lying together on some ice on the west bank of the river. The location was about 2 miles downstream from the spot where the boys' scent had been tracked and 150 feet upriver from the St. Anthony Dam. The caps also had some plant burrs embedded on them, and when they were shown to Kenneth Sr. and Betty, they believed that the caps belonged to their missing sons. In addition, Kenneth Sr. would discover a pair of Roman Catholic catechisms in a cave near the river, which he also believed belonged to the boys. This furthered the police's belief that the 3 brothers had been playing near the river before they all fell in, so the water level was lowered 2 feet, and the river was extensively searched and dragged several times. Even though they were unable to find any bodies or conclusive evidence that the boys had fallen into the water, the Minneapolis PD still reached the conclusion that all 3 of them had drowned. At one point, Police Superintendent Thomas Jones wrote a letter to Minnesota Senator and future United States Vice President Hubert Humphrey in which he stated, quote, "The 3 children went into the river at the point to which they were traced by the tracking dog, and because of the extremely high water and ice, were carried far down the river, which probably resulted in complete destruction of their bodies." End quote. On November the 15th, 5 days after Kenneth, David, and Danny went missing, the Minneapolis PD officially called off the search effort and closed the investigation. Well, the Klein family did not buy the explanation that the 3 boys simply fell into the river and drowned. One issue was that Kenneth, David, and Danny had arranged to meet their brother Gordon in Farview Park that afternoon, and the family did not believe they would have left the park and walked over a mile to the bank of the river without him. According to Gordon, there had been a previous incident where he once swung from a rope into the Mississippi River and nearly drowned until some other kids pulled him out. Since his younger brothers were aware of this incident, Gordon felt they would have been extra cautious about going near the river and not put themselves into a position to accidentally fall into the water. In addition, no witnesses reported seeing the boys in the park or in the vicinity of the river that afternoon. Kenneth had also been wearing a red jacket, while Danny wore a red snowsuit, so their family believed that if they had fallen into the water, their clothing would have been seen during the search effort, particularly since civil air patrol planes flew over the river. The only evidence to suggest that the boys had been near the river was the discovery of the 2 woolen caps on top of the ice, but Kenneth Sr. and Betty came to believe that their sons may have been abducted, and the responsible party intentionally planted the caps at that location in order to throw off the investigation. Well, it wasn't long before a Minneapolis postal inspector intercepted an anonymous postcard which was addressed to the Klein residence and turned it over to the local FBI field office. It was postmarked November the 15th and read, quote, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Klein, I suppose you are worrying about 3 children who disappeared Saturday. Don't worry, they will be all right if you raise $15,000 by Tuesday, November the 20th, 1951. If you don't raise the money by November the 20th, we will have to dispose of your 3 children. If you want your 3 children, drive out on Highway 169 at 11 p.m., 10 miles north of Princeton, Minnesota. You will then see a blue Ford by the roadside. Inside will be your 3 children. If you have the $15,000 with you, they will be yours. Don't try any tricks." End quote. Even though the Minneapolis PD had closed the case, the FBI was allowed to launch their own investigation since kidnapping was a federal crime. They contacted the Kleins and offered to set up a sting operation where Kenneth Sr. could travel to the spot specified in the postcard to meet the author, and they would watch over him. On the evening of November the 20th, the FBI took Kenneth Sr. to this location, which is about 60 miles outside of Minneapolis, but no one else showed up, and the Kleins received no further contact from the author. While the postcard contained an unidentified fingerprint, it could not be matched up to anyone, and while the handwriting had a distinctive cursive, it did not match any handwriting samples that the FBI had in their files. Overall, the ransom demand was believed to be a hoax, and since there was no conclusive evidence that a kidnapping had taken place, the FBI can no longer conduct their own investigation into the boys' disappearance. Even though the Minneapolis PD kept their investigation closed, the Kleins continued to hold out hope that Kenneth, David, and Danny were still alive somewhere, as they would frequently place ads in the Minneapolis Star asking for information and offered a $500 reward. 2 months after the boys' disappearance, Betty gave birth to a son named Mike, and over the course of the next 9 years, she would go on to have 3 more sons named Thomas, Lanny, and Donald. The Kleins eventually decided that it was too painful to remain living in Minneapolis and wanted to help give Gordon a fresh start, so the family decided to return to Kenneth Sr.'s original hometown of Monticello and moved into a farmhouse. Kenneth Sr. and Betty baked cakes for their missing sons every year on their birthdays and continued to buy them Christmas gifts in case they ever returned. The family also stopped taking vacations, as Kenneth Sr. and Betty would spend all of their disposable income traveling the country to follow up on tips they received. Since they believed the boys may have been kidnapped as part of a black market adoption operation, they visited various schools across the state to search for them in case they were living elsewhere with new families under new identities. And believe it or not, at one point, the Kleins made a trip to Virginia in order to consult with the so-called psychic horse, Lady Wonder. You might recall that over 6 years ago, I covered the 1952 disappearance of 10-year-old Connie Smith on episode number 109 of this podcast, and delved a little bit into Lady Wonder's background. Long story short, she was a horse who supposedly had psychic abilities, as whenever she was asked questions, she would provide answers by using her snout to tap a series of blocks containing every letter of the alphabet in order to spell out words. Lady Wonder found fame after she apparently used these blocks to spell out the location where a missing boy was found, so she would be called upon to provide her so-called services in a bunch of other missing children's cases, including this one. When Lady Wonder was asked about the whereabouts of the Klein brothers, she responded by spelling out the words Channel Street, and it turned out there was a Channel Street located in St. Paul, Minnesota, not far from the Mississippi River. However, even though Kenneth Sr. performed a search of this street, it was mostly abandoned, and he did not find anything of interest. In 1954, the Kleins got in touch with Senator Hubert Humphrey, who agreed to assist them and contacted the Minneapolis PD to inquire about the status of the missing boys. When Superintendent Thomas Jones responded to the senator, he informed him that the investigation was at a standstill and his department was unable to do anything else because they continued to believe that the 3 boys had drowned in the river. 2 years later, the Kleins were contacted by an acquaintance named Leonard Lidholm, who expressed his suspicions about a former male neighbor of theirs from Minneapolis. This neighbor had allegedly molested one of Lidholm's family members, and Lidholm claimed that the man often met up with the Klein brothers and would give them candy and take them to a cave located on the banks of the Mississippi River, which was apparently the same cave where the 2 Catholic catechisms had been found after they went missing. The neighbor's name has never been released publicly, but a Minneapolis police captain informed the Kleins that the man had already been investigated and no evidence was found to indicate that he was involved in the boys' disappearance. Over the next 4 decades, the Kleins would continue to publish newspaper ads asking for information about the whereabouts of Kenneth, David, and Danny, but this would not lead to any promising new developments. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the Kleins were hoping to get the brothers' story featured on Unsolved Mysteries to commemorate the 40th anniversary of their disappearance. They started a petition for this and managed to collect 10,000 signatures, and after it was submitted to the show, the producers did seem genuinely interested about putting together a segment. But before shooting began, the producers ultimately changed their mind and decided not to profile the case, and the Kleins would run into the same issue when they attempted to get the boys' story featured on the Maury Povich show. In 1996, the family was contacted by a man named Tom Kemp, a former Missouri resident who had seen one of the newspaper ads about the missing brothers. Kemp was now living in Arizona and claimed that he had come across a flyer in a truck stop featuring age-enhanced composite sketches of the brothers, and he was struck by how much he resembled David. Kemp came to believe that he was David, as they shared the same birthday, March the 7th, and Kemp claimed that he had childhood memories of such images as his brother Danny drowning in the Mississippi River, Danny being buried in a shallow grave at the riverbank, and David being taken away from the scene by law enforcement officers on a truck. Kemp also said that he had been sold to his adoptive family for only $22, and they did not treat him well while he was growing up. Mike Klein traveled to Arizona to meet with Kemp, and members of the family became convinced that he was David, as Kemp seemed to remember specific details about David's childhood, such as playing in his grandparents' backyard and burying some of his mother's costume jewelry in a hole there. Kemp agreed to provide a sample of his DNA for testing, but when it was compared with DNA from other members of the Klein family, the results showed no genetic connection, ruling out the possibility that Kemp was David. Regardless, since the Kleins always suspected that Kenneth, David, and Danny were abducted, they felt that Kemp may have been a trafficked child himself and crossed paths with the missing brothers at some point, which would explain why he seemed to know so much information about them. But nothing was ever found to prove that Kemp had any real knowledge of the boys' disappearances, and he died in 2019. Well, another individual who came across one of the Klein's newspaper ads was a journalist and author named Jack Alhai, who mostly wrote about medicine and science, but became very interested in the brothers' story. In November of 1997, Alhai traveled to Monticello to meet with Kenneth Sr. and Betty, and he decided to perform his own independent investigation into their sons' disappearances and conducted some extensive research. The following year, High published his findings in an article for the magazine Minnesota Monthly titled The Lost Brothers. Another individual who became interested in the case was Jim Schultz, a veteran sergeant for the Minneapolis Park Police. Even though the Minneapolis Police Department had handled the original investigation, the Park Police was a separate law enforcement agency which technically had jurisdiction over Farview Park, which is where the boys had been heading when they went missing. Even though his investigation would be unofficial, Sergeant Schultz decided to take his own fresh look at the Klein brothers' disappearance and re-examined all the evidence. Schultz spoke with a retired Hennepin County medical examiner named Gary Peterson, who disagreed with the police's original theory about the boys drowning in the Mississippi River. Peterson felt that the odds were 1 in a million that 3 brothers from the same family could all drown together in the same river and none of them would be found. When the water got warmer in the spring, Peterson believed that the boy's body would have filled with gas and became bloated, so at least one of them should have risen to the surface. During his new investigation, Sergeant Schultz turned up 2 intriguing potential suspects who could have been involved in the boys' disappearance. One of them was Richard Fossey, a former playground instructor with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. Fossey often worked in Farview Park, and he supposedly knew the Klein brothers and abruptly left Minneapolis shortly after the boys went missing. Fossey relocated to Chicago, and a few years later, in October of 1955, he would become a potential suspect in the murders of 3 other boys: 14-year-old Robert Peterson, 13-year-old John Schuessler, and his 11-year-old brother, Anton Schuessler Jr. The boys were all beaten and strangled to death before their nude, bound, and gagged bodies were found piled on top of each other in a ditch. Fossey died in 1962, and the crime remained unsolved for 4 years until a child predator named Kenneth Hansen was finally charged and convicted of all 3 murders. It was believed that the boys were killed inside a horse stable where Hansen worked, but investigators still looked into the possibility that Fossey may have helped cover up the crime or dispose of the bodies. No evidence has ever been found to indicate that Fossey was involved in the Klein brothers' disappearance, but he was never thoroughly investigated by the Minneapolis PD. The other intriguing potential suspect was a man named Lloyd Paddock, a truck driver who had lived on Bryant Avenue North in the same neighborhood as the Klein family and was 40 years old at the time the boys went missing. Schultz managed to get a hold of an FBI memo from 1961, which reported that a psychiatrist from Scottsdale, Arizona, had treated a 33-year-old female patient who was a former Minneapolis resident and acquainted with Paddock. This woman alleged that Paddock had molested her 5-year-old daughter in 1953, and she also suspected that he was responsible for the disappearance of the Klein brothers. There was nothing in the FBI's records to indicate that they ever followed up on this information, but it turned out that on the day after the boys went missing, one of Paddock's friends showed up at his residence, as Paddock had previously asked him for assistance with pouring a new concrete floor in his basement. But the friend was surprised to discover that Paddock had taken the initiative to pour the entire floor on his own, even though it would have been a very arduous job that likely required him to stay up all night. This friend also noticed that the wooden bed in Paddock's pickup truck had recently been replaced. Shortly thereafter, the search effort for the Klein brothers was launched, and when the friend's wife asked Paddock if he would participate, he allegedly replied, quote, "They're not worth looking for." Much like Fossey, Paddock was never investigated by police at the time of the boys' disappearances, and he died in 1975. In 2004, the Kleins hired the services of a private investigator named Michael Sadovich, and at one point, he was contacted by a woman who was dying of cancer and wanted to reveal some new information. The woman claimed that back in 1951, she owned a fourplex on West Broadway Avenue in the Kleins neighborhood, and shortly before the brothers went missing, she recalled renting out a room in the fourplex to a man in his 50s whom she described as, quote-unquote, creepy, and he was also rumored to be a pedophile. This guy was accompanied by a younger man who may have been a teenager, and they paid their rent in cash. Well, on the same day the Klein brothers disappeared, the woman claimed that she saw this man and his young companion playing basketball outside the fourplex with 3 young boys. When they finished, the group walked in the direction of Farview Park, and about 60 to 90 minutes later, the creepy man and the younger man returned to the fourplex alone. While the woman didn't realize it at the time, These three boys supposedly matched the descriptions of the Klein brothers, and once their disappearance made the news, the woman came to believe that they were the same three boys she had seen. However, because she was afraid of her creepy tenant, the woman never came forward and remained silent about the whole situation for over 50 years. Michael Sadovich eventually stopped working for the Kleins, but he found the woman to be credible and believed that at least one of the men worked at a nearby steel mill and may have lured the boys there in order to kill them. While Sadovich gave a dossier of his findings to the Klein family, it has since been lost, so we don't know the names of the woman or her two male tenants. Indeed, a lot of the original evidence from the case has gone missing, including the two woolen caps found on the ice atop the Mississippi River. Since the original investigators never performed any forensic analysis on the caps, they were returned to the Klein family, but over the course of the next several decades, they just seemed to disappear without explanation, destroying the possibility of testing the caps to see if they had any traces of DNA that belonged to the three brothers, or any outside parties who might have been involved in their disappearances. Even though his son's case was starting to garner new attention, Kenneth Klein Sr. never received conclusive answers about what happened to them, and he passed away in March of 2005 at the age of 87. However, 5 years later, the case wound up in the hands of two new investigators from the Wright County Sheriff's Office, the presiding law enforcement agency which oversees Monticello. In 2010, a Wright County Sheriff's deputy named Lance Sauls was asked to look into a set of human bones which had been found in a gravel pit near the town of Dayton over a decade earlier, and explore potential connections to the Klein brothers case. It turned out that these bones were actually centuries old and of Native American origin, but Saul still became intrigued enough by the Klein case to track down Betty and interview her. It wasn't long before Sauls and another Wright County deputy named Jessica Miller decided to open their own investigation into the Klein brothers' disappearance, though their investigation was considered to be unofficial since the case was still technically under the jurisdiction of the Minneapolis Police Department. They contacted Jack Alhai and Jim Schultz to ask for all the information they had compiled during their own research and investigations into the case, and they also collected a sample of Betty's DNA to submit it into NamUs for possible matches. During one interview, Jessica Miller stated, quote, "I can't let this case go. I can't seem to walk away from it. Something happened to those boys, and I owe it to the family to figure it out." End quote. Sadly, Betty Klein passed away in March of 2013 at the age of 88, though she left behind 5 sons, 5 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. 4 years later, Lanny Klein died in July of 2017 at the age of 60, but at the time of this recording, the other 4 Klein sons, Gordon, Donald, Thomas, and Mike, are all still alive and continuing to seek answers about what happened to their 3 missing siblings. Since he was the only brother who was born before Kenneth, David, and Danny disappeared, Gordon has always struggled with his decision not to accompany them to Farview Park on the day they went missing. By the time he reached adulthood, Gordon said he was unable to handle spending holidays with his family and felt it was difficult for him to connect with his 4 brothers who were born after the disappearances, as they almost felt like his quote-unquote new family. He also claims that he suffered from memory lapses and that due to a possible attempt to block out the trauma, he went through a period of several years when he cannot remember anything about the day his brothers went missing. Deputy Sauls and Miller eventually presented the findings from their new investigation to a number of law enforcement officials and experts from numerous agencies, including the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, who concurred with the belief that the Klein brothers did not simply just drown. An attempt was made to add profiles for Kenneth, David, and Danny to the database of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but it took a while for this to happen, since they needed the Minneapolis PD, the lead investigative agency, to sign a waiver authorizing them to proceed. At least 2 requests have been made by the Wright County Sheriff's Office and other investigative agencies to use ground-penetrating radar to scan the basement floor of Lloyd Paddock's former residence, but the current tenant has refused to grant permission, even though they have been assured that they would be reimbursed for any damage that might be caused by a dig. Once again, since they are the official investigative agency, only the Minneapolis PD has the authority to obtain a search warrant for the residence, but they've declined to do so. In October of 2019, Jack Alhai would publish and release a book about this case titled The Lost Brothers, A Family's Decades-Long Search, and almost immediately thereafter, a new long-form 6-episode podcast series was released titled Long Lost, which was produced by Twin Cities PBS and hosted by Al Hai. The Klein brothers' surviving relatives are continuing to search for answers and are doing everything in their power to keep this story in the spotlight, but after nearly 74 years, the disappearances of Kenneth, David, and Danny continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So there's nothing more heartbreaking than an unsolved cold case where multiple children from the same family are murdered or go missing together, as that's the worst possible thing that a parent can experience. One of the most famous examples of this is the disappearance of the Beaumont children, which took place in Australia in 1966 and involved 3 young siblings, ages 9, 7, and 4, simultaneously going missing during a trip to the beach. What makes that story all the more devastating is that, unlike this case, the 3 siblings turned out to be the only children their mother and father ever had, and they both wound up living into their 90s without receiving any answers about what happened. There seems to be zero doubt that the Beaumont children were abducted, but at least their disappearance generated one of the biggest investigations in the history of Australia, whereas Kenneth, David, and Danny Klein were written off as being the victims of an accidental drowning only 5 days after they originally went missing. Now, I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that the Klein brothers didn't drown, but it's apparent that most cold case investigators who have worked on this over the past few decades do not believe that's what happened. If it was just one boy who disappeared, I could buy that he fell into the Mississippi River and drowned, and his body was just never found. But what are the odds that the same thing could happen to 3 brothers at the same time, and no evidence be left behind, aside from a pair of woolen caps? Of course, as tragic as it was for Betty and Kenneth Klein Sr. to lose 3 of their children, they at least had one surviving child, Gordon, and went on to have 4 more sons. But I'm sure it must have been particularly difficult for Betty, since she was initially reluctant to allow the boys to go to Farview Park that day because of the cold weather, before she ultimately relented, a decision that I'm sure she regretted many times over. Like I mentioned earlier, this was also a particularly traumatic ordeal for Gordon, as he said that he had a hard time connecting with his siblings who were born after Kenneth Jr., David, and Danny went missing. He obviously felt a lot of guilt over the fact that he elected not to accompany his 3 brothers to Farview Park that day, and instead told them that he would meet them later, and who knows if things might have turned out differently if Gordon had gone with them. Regardless of whether they were the victim of a kidnapping or an accidental drowning, the odds of their disappearances taking place probably would have decreased if there were 4 boys present instead of 3. Ironically enough, when he was 5 years old, Gordon had actually saved 2 of his brothers when he rescued Kenneth and David from a fire in their basement, and he even wound up being featured in the newspaper for this. At an earlier point in his life, Gordon did agree to undergo hypnosis to see if he could recover some of his lost memories of his brothers, but when Jim Schultz opened his own investigation years later, he wanted to place Gordon under hypnosis again to see if he could recall some potentially important details from the day his brothers went missing. However, Gordon declined to go through with it, claiming that these memories were too traumatic and painful to bring back, which caused great frustration for Schultz. If you listen to the Long Lost podcast, some of Gordon's brothers are interviewed, and they are critical of his decision and even wonder if he might know more about the disappearances than he's letting on. Of course, given that Gordon was 9 years old at the time, I'm sure he wasn't directly involved, but could he have seen or heard something important that day, which, for his own personal reasons, he doesn't want to recollect or talk about? Remember, Gordon did walk to Farview Park that afternoon in order to meet his brothers at a prearranged spot under a specific oak tree and discover they were not there, but hypothetically, what if he actually witnessed something that he has repressed from his memory? In fact, Schultz has even wondered if Gordon may have suffered abuse at the hands of someone who was connected to his brother's disappearance, and he doesn't want to revisit this. Of course, this is all just speculation, but one thing which Gordon has always maintained is that because they had arranged to meet, there's no way his brothers would have left the park without him and ventured about a mile to the bank of the Mississippi River in order to fall into the water and drown. Regardless of whether you believe the Klein brothers were the victims of an accidental drowning or an abduction, one thing I'm sure we can all agree on is that the Minneapolis Police Department performed a very inadequate investigation and should have spent a lot more time searching for the boys before they settled on their drowning theory with little evidence and decided to close the case. In fact, this has actually made some of the surviving Klein siblings suspect that an intentional cover-up took place and the Minneapolis PD may have been directly involved in the boys' disappearances. Before he passed away, Kenneth Sr. shared a story about how after the investigation was closed, 2 Minneapolis police officers showed up at his residence and told him that they would continue to work the case and search for the boys on their own time. But then a few weeks later, these 2 cops abruptly changed their minds, alleging that they had been told by their superiors to drop the case or they would be fired. But if this is true, I'd say it's more likely that the Minneapolis PD just didn't want to be proven wrong, and they were not acting nefarious because they were directly involved in what happened. Back in 1951, I believe that law enforcement and the public in general just didn't have as much knowledge about child predators, so they couldn't fathom the idea of 3 boys being abducted and murdered simultaneously, which is why they quickly leaped to the drowning theory. Hell, if you search online discussions about this case, you'll see some commenters express shock that an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and 4-year-old were allowed to leave their home and walk to a public park on their own, but 1951 was just a much different time. I previously made mention of how a family acquaintance named Leonard Lidholm once pointed towards a potential suspect who had allegedly molested one of Lidholm's relatives, and Kenneth Sr. and Betty would claim that this was the first time they had ever heard of the concept of molestation. Of course, adults these days are now so much more paranoid about children's safety, so if 3 brothers went missing under these circumstances in modern times, I think a much more extensive investigation would be performed before law enforcement reached the conclusion that they drowned. So what's unique about this case is that even though the disappearances have been investigated by such law enforcement agencies as the Minneapolis Park Police and the Wright County Sheriff's Office, the Minneapolis Police Department still technically have jurisdiction. But unfortunately, since the case is over 70 years old and is considered to be something of a black mark on their reputation, the Minneapolis PD have never shown much interest in investing time and resources to figure out what happened to the boys. The red tape is enough to make your head explode because if the Klein brothers were abducted or harmed at Farview Park, their case would technically be under the jurisdiction of the Minneapolis Park Police, who would have free reign to do whatever they wanted. However, we technically can't be certain that the boys even made it to Farview Park that day, as no witnesses reported seeing them there, and something could have happened to them before they even arrived. Or alternatively, they left the park and fell into the Mississippi River, in which case the Minneapolis PD would have jurisdiction and could stick to their drowning narrative without feeling any obligation to do anything. We'll talk more about this angle later on, but there has been speculation that the boys' remains may be buried underneath the basement of a residence located not too far from where they lived, but the Minneapolis PD are the only ones who have the legal authority to get a search warrant to perform a dig of the basement, and given the costs involved, this doesn't seem to be a top priority for them. In spite of the age of this case, there are still a number of investigators who care about finding out what happened to Kenneth, David, and Danny, but whether they have the legal power to do anything about it is another matter. Like I just mentioned, the Klein family has always believed that since the 3 brothers had arranged to meet Gordon in Farview Park, they find it very unlikely that they would have walked all the way to the west bank of the Mississippi River near the Lowry Avenue Bridge, particularly since this spot was about a mile away from the park, and would an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and 4-year-old really have been compelled to travel that far? And even if they did, this was a cold November day, so why would they feel the need to get so close to this icy river that all 3 of them managed to somehow fall in? The main reason this drowning theory even came about in the first place is that a tracking dog supposedly followed their scent to an uprooted tree near the river. But even today, there's controversy about tracking dogs and how reliable they are, so I'm definitely willing to question the reliability and accuracy of a tracking dog from 1951, which is what most of the investigators who have worked this case over the past few decades have done. You also have to remember that the dog never actually tracked the scent from Farview Park, but from a street curb where a witness supposedly saw the 3 boys sitting, with one of them crying out, quote, "Mommy, Mommy." But it was never conclusively established if this sighting was accurate or these boys were actually the Klein brothers. And before the dog tracked the boys' scent to the river, it initially followed another trail to the Northside Police Station about 5 miles away, and since I seriously doubt that the boys went there, I really don't know if you can trust the dog's findings. Now, the main reason the police ultimately gravitated towards the drowning theory is because of the discovery of 2 plaid woolen caps on top of some ice in the bank of the river about 2 miles downstream from the spot where the scent was tracked. The boys were believed to be wearing these caps when they left the house, but their family has always felt that they were planted on the ice by the person who was responsible for their disappearance in order to give off the false impression they had drowned. That idea might seem far-fetched on the surface, but the caps were not discovered until 3 days after the boys originally went missing, and the dog had already tracked their scents to the river. If the responsible party heard that the police were searching the area, I can see them taking advantage of the situation by placing the caps on the ice, and if this was their strategy, it technically worked, since the investigation was closed a few days later. Another issue is that plant burrs were found embedded in the caps, and I seriously doubt those burrs would have been there if the boys were wearing them and they simply fell off their heads. But since no forensic testing was ever performed, it was never established where the plant burrs originated from. I know that not all drowning victims are going to be found, and the Mississippi River is a large body of water, but I still find it troubling that the only evidence which was ever recovered were 2 caps which happened to be lying side by side on top of the same layer of ice. The boys were all dressed in layers of winter clothing, some of which was bright red, but no witnesses came forward to report seeing them in the water or anywhere near the river during that time period. Before they closed the case, the police had lowered the level of the water 2 feet, and this wound up exposing an intake rack for the St. Anthony Dam. They initially felt it was impossible for any bodies to have passed through there, yet even though they never found any bodies, they still concluded that the boys likely drowned and floated away. Another troubling piece of evidence which doesn't get discussed as much were the discovery of 2 Roman Catholic catechisms in a cave near the river, which also supposedly belonged to the boys. On one hand, this has been used as evidence to support the theory that the boys drowned, because if they wanted to get close to the river, they could have placed the catechisms inside the cave to prevent them from getting wet. But on the other hand, why would they bring along these catechisms to begin with for what was supposed to be a trip to the park on a winter day? Was it common practice for them to carry these items while they were playing outside? We'll get back to this angle later on, but a neighbor was later accused of having lured the boys to that cave. Since there were no reported sightings of the boys in Farview Park that afternoon, it does make me wonder if they crossed paths with someone who did them harm before they arrived. I still find it troubling that 2 separate series of items which supposedly belonged to the boys were discovered in close proximity to the Mississippi River, yet no conclusive evidence was uncovered to prove that they actually drowned. It's truly ironic that after the Minneapolis PD closed the case, the FBI then became involved after the Kleins received a postcard demanding a $15,000 ransom for the boys' safe return. The possibility of kidnapping turned this into a federal investigation, but of course, the card's author never showed up for their scheduled meeting to collect the ransom, and the Minneapolis PD did not find this to be a compelling enough lead to reopen the case, as they believed the postcard was nothing more than a hoax. The Kleins would later go so far as to write to then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to ask for assistance, but Hoover personally replied to confirm that since there was no conclusive proof that the boys had actually been kidnapped, the case fell outside the FBI's jurisdiction and there was nothing more they could do. This meant that the Kleins were essentially trapped in limbo, as the Minneapolis PD refused to do anything, so they had to do all the work spreading awareness about the boys' disappearances through newspaper ads, and no one affiliated with law enforcement really did a proper investigation until the late 1990s. Overall, I am inclined to believe that the ransom demand was just a hoax, dreamed up by some greedy opportunist who read about the case in the newspapers and attempted to take advantage of the situation. The Kleins were just your average middle-class family who were not particularly wealthy, so they did not seem to be a likely target for a ransom kidnapping. And even if they were, it would be far more logical to kidnap only one of their children rather than trying to simultaneously handle 3 of them. I don't know if this is just a coincidence, but I find it interesting that the postcard was postmarked on November the 15th, the same day that the Minneapolis PD officially closed the investigation. If the author was aware of this, they may have thought they would be able to scam some money out of the Kleins without interference from the authorities, but they chickened out once the FBI became involved. But even so, it's still ridiculous that the Minneapolis PD did not believe this ransom demand was worthy of performing a further investigation to try and figure out for certain if the boys were kidnapped. Over the years, the Klein family always tried to hold out hope that if Kenneth, David, and Danny were abducted, it was done by some sort of black market adoption ring, which meant that they could have been sold to some families and continued living their lives under false identities. It is true that these sort of black market adoption rings did exist back then, and the most notorious child trafficker was Georgia Tan, who operated the Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis and arranged for the kidnapping and illegal adoption of thousands of children over the course of 3 decades. Of course, Tan died of cancer in 1950, 1 year before the Klein brothers went missing, but that doesn't mean other child traffickers just like her weren't still in operation in the United States during that time period. Of course, 45 years later, a man named Tom Kemp came forward and expressed his belief that he was David Klein, but even though this possibility was ruled out by DNA testing, the family still suspected that Kemp may have known something about the brothers' disappearance. There definitely seems to be something off about Kemp's backstory, so it's definitely possible that he was a trafficked child and kidnapped from his birth family for the purposes of an illegal adoption, but I am skeptical of the idea that he ever crossed paths with Kenneth, David, or Danny. I can understand why the Kleins would cling to this black market adoption theory, because as horrifying as that scenario is, at least it could mean that the boys went on to live long, happy lives being raised by loving families, which is certainly preferable to believing that they drowned or were murdered by some predator. However, I think the odds of this happening with 3 brothers from the same middle-class family are pretty minuscule, and at the very least, Kenneth and David would have been old enough to retain memories of their lives before they went missing. So sadly, I believe that if the boys didn't drown, they likely crossed paths with the wrong person who did them harm. Of course, abducting and subduing 3 children simultaneously would be a very challenging thing for only one person to pull off, so it's certainly possible that multiple people were responsible for their disappearance. This theory was pretty much pushed forward by a woman dying of cancer who spoke to Michael Sadovich, the private investigator hired by the Klein family. To recap, this woman owned a fourplex in the Klein's neighborhood in 1951 and claimed that she rented a room to a creepy tenant who may have been a pedophile and a young male companion who may have been a teenager. On the afternoon the Klein brothers went missing, the woman said that she saw these guys playing basketball with 3 boys who resembled Kenneth, David, and Danny. The group then headed off in the direction of Farview Park, but when the creepy man and his companion returned over an hour later, they were alone and the boys were never seen again. Now, unfortunately, this woman didn't share her story until over 50 years after the fact, and since the Klein family apparently lost all the materials that Sadovich compiled during his investigation, we don't know the name of the woman or her tenants, so there's no way to verify this account, and it's nothing more than hearsay. I have no idea if there's any truth to this story, but we know of at least one notorious serial killer, the Candyman Dean Corll, who used younger teenage accomplices to help lure his victims to him, so maybe this tenant and his male companion were doing the same thing, and after playing a game of basketball together, they took the Klein brothers somewhere and murdered them before disposing of their bodies. But without any hard facts or concrete proof that these 2 men actually existed, I'm not sure how much credence I'd put into this theory. So when the Wright County Sheriff's Office began their own investigation in 2010, they put together their own list of potential suspects. In addition to the aforementioned tenant and his companion, the other names on this list included Lloyd Paddock, Richard Fosse, Leonard Lidholm, and Helgi Mattsson, the railroad worker who discovered the woolen caps on the frozen riverbank. As far as I can tell, there is no incriminating evidence to suggest that Mattsson was involved in the disappearances and staged the scene, but I'm guessing he was put on the list because he was never thoroughly investigated by the Minneapolis PD in order to be formally ruled out as a suspect. Leonard Lidholm's connection to the case is that he approached the Kleins and expressed his suspicions about a former neighbor who had allegedly molested one of Lidholm's family members. As we're going to talk about momentarily, Lloyd Paddock would be accused of molesting a child, but it sounds like this accusation was made by an entirely different person, so the neighbor Lidholm was referring to was not Paddock. Lidholm claimed that this neighbor would often give the Klein brothers candy and take them to a cave near the Mississippi River, but the problem is that Lidholm never shared this information until 5 years after the boys went missing. This may be why investigators put Lidholm on their list of potential suspects, as perhaps they felt he was completely fabricating his allegations about the neighbor, but much like Helgi Mattsson, I don't believe there's any evidence pointing towards Lidholm's involvement either. Once again, since a thorough investigation was never performed back in 1951, most of the so-called evidence pointing towards the potential suspects on this list is based on nothing more than hearsay. It seems like most of the focus has been pointed towards Richard Fossey, who often worked at Farview Park during that time period, and Lloyd Paddock, who lived in the same neighborhood not far from the Klein residence and supposedly did a number of suspicious things right after the boys went missing. I haven't heard anything about either of these men having criminal records or a documented history of violence against children, but on the surface, I would say there's a stronger circumstantial case pointing towards Fossey than Paddock. In addition to working at Farview Park, Fossey was supposedly acquainted with the Klein brothers and left Minneapolis shortly after they vanished, and he became a potential suspect in the murders of 3 other boys in Chicago in 1955, Robert Peterson, John Schuessler, and Anton Schuessler. Of course, another suspect named Kenneth Hansen was charged and convicted of that crime 4 decades later, but there were always rumors that other people helped Hansen cover the whole thing up. I briefly talked about this case way back on episode number 166 of this podcast, when I covered the unsolved 1966 disappearances of Ann Miller, Patricia Blau, and Renee Bruhl, aka the Indiana Dunes women, but Kenneth Hansen was a known associate of notorious gangster Silas Jane, who ran a group of criminals known as the Horse Syndicate. Hansen worked at one of Jane's horse stables, the Idle Hour Stables, which is where he sexually assaulted and murdered Robert Peterson and the Schuessler brothers, so in order to avoid being implicated in the crime, Jane arranged to have the victims' bodies moved from there to the ditch where they were ultimately found. Anyway, even though it does not sound like Richard Fossey was directly responsible for these murders, it's been reported that he was looked at as potentially being an accessory, but I can't find his name listed in any of the contemporary media coverage of that case, so I have no idea if he had any connection to Hansen, Jane, or the Idle Hour Stables. I suppose it's possible that Fossey could have been working in Farview Park on the afternoon that Kenneth, David, and Danny went missing, and used this opportunity to harm them, but I'm not going to label Fossey as a child murderer without stronger evidence. For all we know, it might just be a coincidence that Fossey has a tenuous connection to 2 separate cases which took place in separate cities in the Midwest during the 1950s and involved 3 boys. Now, there definitely appear to be more red flags with Lloyd Paddock, though I have to acknowledge that the supposedly suspicious evidence against him is based on nothing more than hearsay. As a refresher, Paddock had asked a friend to help him pour a new concrete floor in his basement on the day after the Klein brothers went missing, but when the friend showed up, he was surprised to discover that Paddock had already completed the job himself, even though it pretty much would have required him to stay up all night and perform a lot of difficult physical labor on his own. He also reportedly replaced the wooden bed in his pickup truck, and when he was asked about participating in the search effort, he made a cryptic remark about how they're quote-unquote not worth looking for. In addition, there is also documentation of a woman once telling a psychiatrist that Paddock molested her 5-year-old daughter, and while it does not sound like this was ever conclusively proven, it does show a potential history of abuse against children. Once again, most of this evidence is based on nothing more than hearsay, but if Kenneth, David, and Danny had elected to take a shortcut and cut through some yards in the neighborhood when they were headed to the park that afternoon, they likely would have gone through Paddock's yard at some point, and well, if he was home at the time, he may have used this opportunity to lure the 3 boys into his house. If this is what happened, it would account for why there are no confirmed sightings of the boys in Farview Park or anywhere else that day. And if they were murdered inside Paddock's home, and he needed to conceal the crime, this would explain his decision to immediately pour a new concrete floor in his basement on his own without assistance. Unfortunately, I really couldn't find much information about Paddock's background to indicate if he would have been capable of an horrific crime like that, but I did manage to find his obituary in the May 1st, 1975 edition of the Minneapolis Star. At the time of his death, Paddock was residing in Robbinsdale, which is a part of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, and he was listed as being survived by a wife and a son. Well, I would be really curious to know if his wife and son were living with them back in November of 1951, because obviously, that would have made it more difficult for Paddock to murder 3 boys inside his home and bury their bodies in the basement. Unfortunately, this is the big side effect of the Minneapolis PD writing off the boys' disappearance as an accidental drowning, because if they had launched a proper missing persons investigation, perhaps Paddock or Richard Fossey could have been interviewed, as they never even popped up on the radar as potential suspects until long after they were dead. We know nothing about their whereabouts that day or if they had alibis, so with the information we have right now, I don't think they can be ruled in or ruled out as suspects. It's also frustrating that the current tenants at Paddock's former residence have not granted permission to dig up their basement, and while I can understand the major inconvenience this might cause, I also would prefer to know with 100% certainty that the remains of 3 murdered boys were not buried beneath my home. And like I previously mentioned, since this case falls within the jurisdiction of the Minneapolis PD, they're the only ones who can obtain a search warrant to perform a dig like this, and they officially consider the case to be closed, even though other law enforcement agencies would like to go through with it. Obviously, if Kenneth, David, and Danny were murdered, the perpetrator, whether it be Paddock, Fossey, or someone else, is probably long deceased. But what's most important is the possibility of recovering the victims' remains and giving them a proper burial. If they really did fall into the Mississippi River and drown, recovering their remains would probably be impossible, but their surviving loved ones deserve to know for certain what happened. While part of me wants to think that the simplest explanation is the correct one, I still think there's something very off about this case, and I remain skeptical that Kenneth, David, and Danny would venture a mile out of their way to walk to the riverbank, and all 3 of them would manage to fall into the river without their bodies or any other evidence being found. I do think there's a good chance that the brothers crossed paths with someone who did them harm, but because the case was closed prematurely, the responsible party managed to get away with it. But even if this case is never solved, we can thank the likes of Jack Alhai, Jim Schultz, Jessica Miller, and Lance Sauls, who have worked diligently to ensure that the Klein brothers are not forgotten and their memories will live on. Hopefully, one of these days, we might receive conclusive answers about what happened. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearances of Kenneth, David, and Danny Klein, please contact the Minneapolis Police Department tip line at 612-692-TIPS. That's 612-692-8477. Anyway, another special thanks to Thomas Crow for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for 8 years now, and if you've already entered, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released another one of my cinema-themed episodes titled 10 Underrated Crime Films, in which I discuss some of my favorite crime movies which I consider to be overlooked. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the story of the Hatbox Baby, an abandoned infant who was supposedly found in the Arizona desert on Christmas Eve in 1931. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Kevin M., Clarissa T., Wilson S., L.H., Stevie M., John, Jeff V., and Robin. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.